Okay, thank you. So we might get started. So good afternoon and welcome to this webinar. I'd first like to acknowledge that I'm recording this webinar from the lands of the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation. I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which you all join us today, and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people watching and participating in this meeting and webinar. So my name is Simone Leyden. I'm the CEO and co-founder of NeuroEndocrine Cancer Australia, and I'm very excited about this Let's Talk webinar because we are joined by Associate Professor Adnan Nagrial, and I knew I would do that, my apologies, who is a consultant medical oncologist specialising in gastrointestinal and thoracic cancers. He is appointed to Westmead and Blacktown Hospitals as Staff Specialist Medical Oncologist. He's a clinical associate professor at the Sydney Medical School of the University of Sydney and Director of Medical Oncology Trial Unit at Westmead Hospital. That's all a bit of a mouthful, and I hope that I've done justice to this long and illustrious career. So we will be talking today about a very important trial that has recently opened or has been is an extension of a trial for a very important unmet need group of neuroendocrine tumours, and that being our high-grade grade 3 NET patients and also our neuroendocrine carcinoma patients. So welcome, Adnan. I would firstly like just to talk to you about, obviously, in introduction to the trial, but also, we know traditionally, these sorts of tumours haven't been responsive to immunotherapy. So it'd be really interesting to hear how this trial came about and why we think that these ones will actually benefit.
So thanks for inviting me to speak or participate today, Simone. It's a privilege to be able to contribute. So I think we sort of got triggered to talk about this because I wanted to try to get information about this trial out to the community as best we could, because all the investigators involved in the trial do think it's an important study, and it's a study that I think patients and consumers would be keen to hear about. But like you said, Simone, immunotherapy, the study is really looking at immunotherapy. And so immunotherapy is something that's been in the press a lot over the last 5 to 10 years. And we're increasingly been able to use that type of treatment in various cancers. Obviously, melanoma is the big poster child for where that treatment has really helped. But definitely over the last 5 years, we've been absolutely exploring immunotherapy as a treatment for lots of cancers. And as you can imagine, and as you well know, when you're involved with neuroendocrine patients with neuroendocrine tumors, is that often trials will take a focus on the more common cancer sites. And that's what's happened with immunotherapy to date. So more common cancers like melanoma and lung cancer and gastrointestinal cancers like colon cancers, where we studied these treatments initially. But we designed this study, and it was actually led by, and it still is led by, a doctor out in Melbourne at Olivia Newton-John, Oliver Klein. And he designed a study really looking to explore the immunotherapies that we were now using in other cancers, a combination of 2 drugs, ipilimumab and nivolumab, and really trying to explore those treatments in those rarer forms of cancer. And that didn't just include neuroendocrine tumors, but absolutely neuroendocrine tumors was an important part of that, part of that design. And we also focused on a few other rarer cancers, so rarer gynae cancers and less common biliary tract cancer. But essentially, it was designed as a basket study to sort of encompass all those patients with those slightly rarer tumors where it's more difficult to run a study specifically just for one tumor group, and to really explore how well those treatments work and how many people you could potentially help with that treatment. So to go back a step, about 3 years ago, we designed this study where patients with those rare forms of tumor, and at that stage, we actually included patients with any form of neuroendocrine cancer. So from any site and for any grade. And so we ran that study over a number of years, and we had the results in 2020, which has all now been published. But essentially what we found was when we gave those 2 drugs and focusing purely on the patients with neuroendocrine cancers, is that when we looked at the outcomes, what we saw was that in patients with higher grade neuroendocrine tumors, so grade 3 in particular, as well as patients that had neuroendocrine carcinomas, we saw responses. So we saw patients where their tumors shrank. And probably most importantly, we saw that response tended to last for very prolonged periods in some cases. So we were seeing the type of benefit that we'd like to see with immunotherapy, where the big win of immunotherapy often is that if you do respond, typically that response can be quite long lasting. And so even if the response rates are low, so for example, if you have a cancer where the odds of it responding are only 10 or 15%, which I think every oncologist and every patient would say is very low, and we'd love it to be higher. But if you are that one of those lucky people where that response occurs, we know it tends to last for years in some situations. So that potential is obviously very exciting for patients and for doctors. And so we're very keen to explore that. So when we looked at that study, to summarize it, we basically found that patients that had lower grade cancer, so grade 1 in particular, we had a number of patients, we didn't see any responses at all, unfortunately. So that historical thought that people with neuroendocrine cancers don't tend to benefit from immunotherapy certainly seemed to be true in lower grade cancers. But when we looked at the higher grade cancers, we saw that there was a response rate, and the response rate was actually quite exciting in a number of ways. So nearly a third of patients with grade 3 neuroendocrine tumors or neuroendocrine carcinomas had a response, and that response means that their cancer shrunk by at least 30%. And again, we saw that benefit seemed to be quite long lasting for those patients. We're not the only group around the world that's done a similar study. So there's a very similar study in the US, which is abbreviated as DART, D-A-R-T. And they've been doing essentially a very similar study, a combination immunotherapy study in rarer cancers, including neuroendocrine tumors. And reassuringly, I guess, in a way, that they found very similar outcomes, that in the patients with lower grade cancers, again, we didn't see a great benefit from the therapies, but they also found a similar response in the higher grade patients with higher grade cancers too. So we sort of had that confirmation that what we saw in that study that we did 2 years ago was potentially more than just a chance or a fluke. I think we were actually seeing something that was potentially very real. So this current study is basically a follow-on from that study. So we took the same drug, so it's still ipilimumab and nivolumab, and instead of focusing on all patients with neuroendocrine tumors, now that we know that patients with grade 3 neuroendocrine tumors and neuroendocrine carcinomas are the group that potentially has the best chance of this treatment helping them, this study is very much focused on that group of patients. And what we're trying to really work out is trying to get a more accurate idea of what is that percentage that will potentially benefit. Is it really a third? Or is it higher, or is it lower? And I guess importantly, as part of that, we are collecting, patient samples and lots of other research samples to really try to work out for the patients where it works, why did it work? And most importantly, for the people that it didn't help, why did it not help? And we're very hopeful that this sort of approach and if we can continue to show consistent results similar to the previous studies as well as the studies overseas, this could hopefully lead to a result where we could go to regulatory bodies and funding bodies like the PBS and really try to get these sorts of treatments made available for patients with more rarer cancers, because doing the traditional randomized phase 3 that we do in other cancers where they're a little bit more common notoriously have been very difficult to perform in cancers that are less common and where the patients are more spread across the country because they are rarer. So it's harder to do these studies. So we have had that experience with other in other areas where if you do these studies well, even without randomization, and you show a very consistent benefit, it can lead to approvals and funding. So I guess ultimately that's the goal here, to really give us a very good impression of that, a really good idea of what that absolute number of potential benefit is, and then potentially pursue it so it's made more widely available to everyone.
Yeah, absolutely. And just touching on that, I guess the rationale, and one of the questions has been the names of the drug, and I know you mentioned them, and we sort of, do again, because I get tongue-tied, the IPI and Nevo. But I guess, I've heard from an oncologist before that, and this might be a different kind of combination therapy, but that, one of them sort of takes the cloak off the tumor, if you like, and the other one actually penetrates inside the tumor. Is that the rationale as to why you sort of use the two?
Yeah, so I guess that's important that we talk about how these drugs work. So that basically is right. So if you imagine your immune system, it's going around your body constantly looking for problems to try to fix, and it relies on signals to know when there's a problem. So if you imagine you're in a car, the immune system's driving around. If it sees a green light, it tells the immune system that that's a problem. It needs to go and do something. If it sees a red light, it's told to, that's your normal heart or your normal liver, don't attack it. And so some cancers take advantage of that normal system and start producing that red light just randomly and tell the immune system that I'm a normal part of your body, leave me alone. And so these drugs, in very simple terms, are trying to get rid of that red light. So that brake system, nivolumab, so Nevo, is basically trying to get rid of that red light. IPI is a little bit more complex in the way it works, but essentially what it does is it also works on the immune system, but in a slightly different way. It doesn't affect the cancer or the immune system locally where the cancer is. It really focuses on going to the lymph gland where the immune system, I guess, mainly originates and sits, and is really trying to boost the types of cells that the lymph node is producing and circulating around the body to try to find the right cell that will fight that cancer that's in the body. So when you combine the two drugs, the rationale is that you're boosting the immune system with IPI, trying to get the body to produce as many white cells of different types as possible to go around the body to identify problems. And then the nivolumab is working at the tumor site to try to get rid of those red light signals so that the immune system can recognize the cancer and, ideally do its job of trying to get rid of it. And when it works, and that beautiful science and the theory is great. Obviously, it's the immune system, like everything in the body, is much more complex than that. And there's lots of other signals and on-off switches and things that also compete. But in very simple terms, that's the concept. Initially, it was just a thought, and we said, "Oh, look, the immune system is going to be much more complicated than this. This can't work. It's too simple." And then when we used it, a decade ago, initially in melanoma and then ultimately lung cancer, it worked just as we had predicted. But again, not in everyone. So that goes back to the fact that the immune system is more complex and it's relying on more than just these single signals to go and no go. So I think that's fundamentally why it doesn't work for everyone, but we know there's a group of patients with particular forms of cancer where it will absolutely help. And once the immune system recognizes the cancer, once you've got that mechanism sorted, cancers develop resistance to drugs over time. That's one of the reasons why, sadly, most cancers can't be cured with chemotherapy or systemic drugs. But when the immune system's the fix or the treatment, if you, for want of a better description, the cancers find it much harder to develop resistance, and therefore the benefits and the responses last a lot longer. That's at least the rationale for why these drugs work for a lot longer than, say, chemotherapy typically does.
Yeah. And as you mentioned, everyone's so different. The immune system's so different. You mentioned earlier that you are collecting other samples. So obviously sort of tissue samples, maybe blood samples, and you're doing that to sort of try and see which predictors or which patients will respond to that.
Yeah, so there's two sides to that. So absolutely, we want to know who's going to get the benefit. So identifying those people. And that's mainly focused around the fact that these drugs, like all treatments, do have side effects. So We can talk about the side effects in a second, but essentially you want to make sure that you give the treatment to the patients that are most likely to benefit, so that those potential side effects are worth the risk. I guess that's one reason. But probably more importantly, from my perspective, is to really identify why it didn't work for certain people, because that's, I guess, my main interest, is to try to get these treatments working for as many people as possible. That's my, I guess, personal agenda here. And I think those samples allow us to try to really work out why it didn't work in certain people and what things could we add that might make it work. And we're not the only people doing that. Everyone that's doing these sorts of trials, looking at immunotherapy in any cancer, is doing exactly the same thing. So there's a lot of work being done to say, we know this works in some situations. Why does it not work in others? And what could we do to make it work, or to get it to work? So yeah, all of that is part of the study, and it is relatively simple. It is, we're collecting tumor specimens in the sense that previously collected specimens we are collecting, and we're also gathering blood samples that we're doing as part of routine blood testing that we do as part of treatment anyway. So we're trying to minimize the burden, so there's no extra tests that we wouldn't otherwise have to do.
Absolutely. I mean, look, it's exciting because, this is a sort of a rarer subgroup of neuroendocrine tumours. So any data that's being collected, any tissue, that's going into a bigger pool is just so incredibly important. And, it's great that obviously, it's collectively around the world, this data is being collected, which is so important. I guess that also then leads to, you talk about that it is grade 3 neuroendocrine tumour and also neuroendocrine carcinoma. And what else is around the inclusion criteria, especially around potentially having other treatments prior, and the importance, I guess, of getting on these trials really quickly?
Yeah. So all trials do have rules. That's just a general principle of trials. And that's, to be honest, is really built around trying to make sure we don't harm anyone that ever volunteers for a trial like this. So there's a lot of rules about making sure it's as safe as we possibly can make it. And we assess that by looking to make sure organ function, particularly things like liver and kidney, are working well, and therefore the risk of harm is minimized. So there are rules around that. They're very specific. And to be honest, as a patient, I don't think you should focus too much on that, other than talk to your doctor about whether that's appropriate. However, I guess the biggest exclusion criteria or criteria that might limit someone's ability to go on this study is that the previous study we did allowed people to have had any line of treatment, as in they could have had 5 lines, they could have had 1 line, it didn't matter, they were still eligible. But when we looked at the data, we found that people that had had many, many lines of previous treatment were much less likely to have a response to the treatment. So this new study we designed with a change where the study requires you to have only had 1 previous line of drug treatment. So for some cancers that we're doing in this study, non-neuroendocrine cancers, that's less of an issue because you don't usually use many lines. But with neuroendocrine cancers, as I'm sure most of the audience knows, there are lots of potential treatment options, which is a good thing. But it does mean that for some people, at least, if they've had 2 or 3 different types of chemotherapy already, as an example, it unfortunately would not be the right trial for them. So I guess one of the benefits of talking about it today was to get the information out to people that may be interested, that if you have had a line of treatment or are considering your first line of treatment of chemotherapy, that is. And I think the important thing to remember is that for grade 3 neuroendocrine tumors and neuroendocrine carcinomas, we still do tend to use chemotherapy, certainly much more often than we would for lower grade tumors. So a lot of the people with these diseases will have had chemotherapy, and after their first type of chemotherapy, if it reaches a point where that's no longer the best treatment for them, I think it's worth remembering that this trial may potentially be an option for you that you may want to think about, and it's important to discuss it with your oncologist. And going on this trial doesn't limit your ability to have those other treatments that are also available. So if you go on this trial and it helps you, then that's wonderful. But obviously, if you go on the trial and this treatment's not the best treatment for you and it's not helping, there are obviously other treatments down the track that we could use in the more standard of care setting that you'd still be able to have. So it doesn't reduce your options. In fact, it gives you an additional one, but there are some rules around when it's the best time to have it. And that's a little bit frustrating, I think, both as a doctor looking after people as well as a patient with the disease, that there are rules that seem arbitrary and unfair. But I guess there is some science behind why it's felt that having had only one line gives you the best chance of benefiting. And we really want to, I guess, prove that this drug helps people with this disease so we can get it on the PBS and get it widely available to anyone, anywhere, rather than having to worry about trying to get on a trial to get access to treatment that could potentially help you. So to allow access, we have tried to open as many sites as we can. The process has been a little bit slower than we'd like, but right now we do have sites in Melbourne. We do have sites in Sydney, including my site at Blacktown. And we do have some sites in regional New South Wales, particularly in Albury, who are open and recruiting. And the hope is that we will be able to start opening this study in other states, because we've linked onto a protocol or a study that is more national, and that should allow us to open it. The problem at the moment is that I don't have those timelines for these other states that I'm sure people would love to know, but we certainly can try to get that information offline and try to provide that.
Absolutely. And I think, as you said, it's knowing about the trial. It's your healthcare professional knowing about the trial, which is so incredibly important. And I think, if there's a little bit more pressure on, we always like to think that, we can try and sort of fast track this. And I guess, that travel to the sites that are open, that has been a question, and it's a question that I posed before. Is there any issues if a patient is in Queensland or is in one of the other states at the moment? Because again, with these particular tumours, we don't like to wait. It can be aggressive, and we need, and time is of the essence. So is there any restrictions, or is there the ability, if the patient has the ability, to go and visit a site?
Yeah, look, I think the first thing to say is that obviously, as a cancer doctor who looks after people, I acknowledge that having to travel interstate when you're unwell and needing to have treatment is not ideal, but the sites that are currently open are more than willing to look after interstate patients and help them get access to the treatment. I guess what we're trying to do, as lots of hospitals around the country are trying to do, is we're increasingly using telehealth when we can, so that we can minimize that burden as best we can. So obviously, or unfortunately, at the moment, you still have to go to the site itself to receive the actual therapy, which is an intravenous infusion every 3 weeks. But in between times where you need appointments to just be, to catch up with the doctors and the trial team, just to make sure everything's okay and you're having the right tests and all the things that you need to have, a lot of that can be done remotely, so that you don't have to be so for example, if you came to my site at Blacktown and you were from Brisbane, you wouldn't have to spend months and months in Sydney to be on the trial. You'd have to be there for the infusions every 3 weeks, which is admittedly a huge burden, but in between times, if within your means, you're able to travel back and forth. The best solution is that we have sites in every state, and that is the goal. But obviously, at the moment, if that hasn't been the case, and it's not a tumor type, as you mentioned, where it's a good idea to wait 3 months for a site to open, and so if it is a possibility to be able to travel, all the sites are more than willing to help look after people that have to travel, and will do their best to, I guess, minimize the burden where we can.
Absolutely. And I think, at least with immunotherapy sort of still being a little bit more common as a treatment, those patients who do travel will still be able to have their side effects potentially managed back in the community by a local oncologist, potentially as well, whilst obviously the trial team is absolutely involved. Could that be a possibility that, so they don't have to travel for any potential side effects?
Yeah, so I guess that's one of the things about this trial, that we're not really using a treatment that oncologists are not familiar with. So I think if you went to your own oncologist and asked them about what Ipi and Nivo are, they will have not only heard of the drug, they would be using it themselves in other situations. So they would be familiar with it. They would know the side effects. They know how it's given. And so you're right. Absolutely. Your local oncologist could very well help contribute to looking after you while you're on the trial, even if you are further away from the site where you're having the treatment. But obviously, yes, you're right. We have good ways of keeping in track of our patients, and we use phone and video and various other ways of keeping track of things. And you can have your blood test locally and all those sorts of things. So it's not a situation where the drug is so new and novel that your oncologist would tell you that they can't answer your questions about the treatment.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess, there's also a question there, which is interesting because we have seen in other trials where compassionate access is sometimes available for those patients off trial. Do you know if that's available here? The question has been asked, could you purchase the drug if you're not on the trial?
Yeah, so
drugs.
The manufacturer of these particular two compounds is a company called Bristol Myers Squibb, which is a very large pharmaceutical company. And essentially for patients in Australia who want to have this treatment for an indication that's not on the PBS, we are lucky in Australia in a lot of ways that it is actually on the PBS for quite a lot of indications where it's been proven to work, but there are still situations where it's not. The company does have a program, a cost share program, where the patients will pay a certain percentage of the actual cost of the drug, and then the company will cost share, will absorb the remaining cost. Honestly, it is still a fairly expensive program for virtually everyone. It goes into the tens of thousands of dollars to have a year's supply of this therapy. But yes, to answer the question, it is available, although certainly at a cost that I think is very prohibitive for the vast majority of Australians.
Absolutely. And I guess it's the importance of trials like this to build the evidence, to get the reimbursement, and to get the patients on the trials. And I guess that leads into another question is, how many patients, or what is the powering of the trial, if you like? How many patients would you like to recruit to this, and over how long?
Yeah, so I guess the plan is to recruit for a 2 to 3 year period, but all of these studies have a relatively simple goal that once you get the patients onto the study as quickly as you can so that you treat as many as you can, then obviously the study will close and we get some results and hopefully be able to tell people how well it works and move forward. But at the moment, at least, the plan is to have quite a number of patients. So the total number is over 140 patients in total. So the study has quite a long way to go at this stage. And I would expect it will be recruiting for at least the next 12 months, at least, based on our projections from our previous study when we recruited a similar tumor groups and similar patients.
And is that 140 across all the other types, like gynae tumours and the other rare tumours as well, or is that just the neuroendocrine?
It is a combination, but there's different numbers for each group. Of course. I think the reassuring thing is the study is still early enough that I think it will be available to patients for quite a while yet.
Yeah, great.
And obviously we keep updating in people with information about the recruitment, but at this stage there's expectation that there's plenty of availability at the moment.
Brilliant. And look, again, this is something that we're very passionate about in the ability to have as many trials open to our patients as possible. And we are really enthused and grateful that there is a dedicated trial just to these higher grade tumours that do seem to not have as many treatment options. And for that, Adnan, we're really grateful to that and grateful to you and your team to ensure that, these trials are made possible. Is there anything else that you think that our patients need to know? Because obviously we really want to get this as far and as wide as possible so that patients are, have the opportunity and have the actual choice to get on this trial as well.
Yeah. So look, I think the main things are, as we've talked about, bring it up with your oncologist looking after you, have a talk about whether they feel this might be an option for you, whether it's a good one or the right one. Like all treatments, we haven't really talked about the side effects in any great detail, but there are side effects for this treatment, just like there are for every treatment. And those side effects in some situations can be serious because the immune system is a very powerful thing. And if you get it very active, it can start to cause problems that we wouldn't necessarily want. So it's not for everyone, and There are things that we do have to look after with it, but I think the reality is that when you put everything together, if you do have it and it helps you, for most people it's well worth it. But we really want it to be available in a group where it's harder to run a randomized controlled trial. We think this approach will potentially give us the information we need to be able to really get this available for patients. And as you mentioned, patients with grade 3 neuroendocrine tumors and neuroendocrine carcinomas, we need more trials. We need more information about what the best treatments are. And we don't want to be relying on data from other tumor groups and other tumor types to make decisions, which we sometimes have to do in this setting, because if the information is not there, you've got to make educated decisions based on what you do have. And it would be definitely better if we could do the studies in the people with the same disease, and so that we can really get those accurate answers and give accurate information to patients about what the best treatment for them might be.
Absolutely. And obviously that just, improves your chances of getting through these regulatory bodies and getting it reimbursed, is by actually having that evidence, which is so important. And just very, very quickly, because obviously, there is a question around those side effects. I guess that's a conversation that you absolutely have with your healthcare professional on weighing those risks. I know with immunotherapy, only through personal family experience, of history of ulcerative colitis and things like that can really, there is that question, but you sort of make the judgment, well, it's that or cancer. And obviously, I think often, and especially in this patient group, they'd probably go, look, I think the risks are probably worth it, but they do have to know that there's other drugs that, like whether it's steroids to ensure that your liver, isn't too overactive, and those sorts of things. But I think, it's a judgment decision.
Yeah, so that's all true. So I guess the side effects generally, again, most oncologists now are very comfortable managing them. So it's not an unknown. We know what the side effects are. We know how to manage them. However, I think you've mentioned an important group. If you have a history of an autoimmune condition, Crohn's disease is an example, rheumatoid arthritis is another. Historically, and even this trial, unfortunately, still has rules around if you've got a significant illness like that concurrently with the cancer, there is restrictions about being able to go on this trial. But I think, Simone, you've hit the nail on the head, and the nail on the head is that in real life, once these drugs are made available on the PBS and we can use them without having to follow strict rules, absolutely. Patients with those conditions have received these treatments. We've got experience within that setting, and we know that, what percentage of patients will have a problem with their underlying autoimmune disease and how to manage it. So it can be managed. But unfortunately, from a trial perspective, for this trial in particular perspective, there are some, unfortunately, restrictions around that even though we're increasingly comfortable that treating someone that has an autoimmune condition with immune therapy can be done. In the trial, at least, they're still relatively restrictive about making sure we don't risk putting someone on the study where on a protocol they get treatment that's not safe for them.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I guess it sort of does put in a little bit more of a restriction there, but I think it's about that risk, which is really important. And I think, again, the more people that are on these immunotherapy trials, the more data there is, and the better management there is. And in my personal experience, it was managed really, really well. And actually, the immunotherapy worked very, very well as well, because of the body was so overactive as well. But it's sort of a fine line management. But I really, again, I cannot thank you enough for explaining this really important MOST circuit trial. We really hope that we could, try and encourage more sites to get open so more patients can access the trial. But obviously, we'll do our best to raise awareness about it, because, patients need to know what their options are, and we really are very, as I said, passionate about that particular group of patients, as we are with all our patients, but that particular subset of patients are very much in need of something like a trial like this, which is great. So thank you so much, and we look forward to, and thank you from Gillian as well, and we look forward to getting updates from you across the time.
Thank you very much for asking me to come on. It was a pleasure.
Fantastic. Thank you.